Today, we're going to go behind the headlines and explore the psychological journey of the incel phenomenon. We're not just looking at the extremes you hear about in the news. We're going to trace the path from what starts as loneliness and rejection all the way to adopting a rigid and sometimes pretty dangerous ideology. To really get this, though, we first have to look at a much bigger social trend that's kind of setting the stage. So let's start with some pretty eye-opening data. This chart from the National Survey of Family Growth, well, it paints a stark picture. Nearly a quarter, 24%, of young men said they had no sexual activity in the past year. Now, that's a huge jump from years past, and it's almost double the rate for young women. So right away, you see this isn't some niche issue. It's a real, measurable shift in how modern relationships are working or not working. So yeah, this just begs the question, what on earth is going on here? Why are so many young people, and young men in particular, finding it so hard to form these intimate connections? To even begin to answer that, we have to take a hard look at the world they're trying to navigate. Okay, so this first part is all about the big picture, the world Gen Z is living in. And honestly, there's a lot of evidence pointing to a kind of love crisis. You've got this widening gap in basically everything from how people date to what they believe politically. And this isn't just a vague feeling. You can see it in the trends. We're seeing less interest in what you might call traditional dating. The big dating apps, they're actually losing their appeal for straight Gen Z folks. And all this leads to a clear downward trend in the number of sexual partners people have. On top of all that, there's this growing political divide. Research shows young women are becoming way more liberal, while young men are trending more conservative. You can imagine how that makes finding common ground just that much harder. And you have to remember, all of this is happening while Gen Z is dealing with some serious underlying pressures. I mean, they're coming of age with massive economic uncertainty and a huge spike in mental health issues. When you're just trying to make rent or, frankly, just trying to stay afloat mentally, going out and trying to be vulnerable with someone, it can feel less like a joy and more like this huge, emotionally draining risk that a lot of people just decide to avoid. Okay, so that's the big picture societal stuff. Now let's zoom in. Let's go from the societal level right down to a core psychological mechanism. We're going to look at what happens inside someone's head when rejection isn't just a one-time thing, but when it becomes a painful, repeating pattern. And this brings us to a really key concept in psychology called learned helplessness. It was first identified way back in the 60s by psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer. And it basically describes what happens when you're repeatedly put in a negative situation that you just can't control. After a while, you start to learn that nothing you do matters. So you just stop trying to change things, even when an escape route finally opens up. And those original experiments found three major effects of this mental state. First, people just stop trying. They become passive, slow to act, even when there's a problem to solve. Second, their ability to learn actually gets worse. They have a really hard time seeing that their actions could make a difference now. And third, they just feel this constant heightened stress that comes from that feeling of being totally powerless. Now, here's a really crucial distinction. There are two ways people tend to explain this feeling to themselves. There's universal helplessness, which is when you think, you know what, this situation is impossible for anyone. But then there's personal helplessness, and that's the belief that other people could succeed, but I can't because I'm just not good enough or I don't have what it takes. That second one, as you can imagine, is way more damaging to your self-esteem. And you know, this kind of vulnerability can start really, really early. This quote just nails it. It talks about how some childhoods can lay the groundwork for these feelings. When a kid has to be the responsible one way too soon, they learn to just push their own needs down. They learn that their feelings always come last. And that can create this deep-seated belief that what they want just doesn't matter, which makes them so much more vulnerable to feeling helpless later in life. So, okay, how does this feeling of helplessness build into something bigger? Well, when you're trapped in that state, feeling rejected, feeling insignificant, your brain desperately starts searching for an explanation. It needs a story, a narrative to make sense of all that pain. A really helpful way to understand what happens next is something called the 3N model of radicalization. It's a framework that says this whole process is driven by three things. First, there's a universal human need to feel like you matter, to have significance. Second, you find a narrative, an ideology that explains your suffering and shows you a path to get that significance back. And third, you find a network, a community of people who all believe the same story and reinforce it. For a lot of men in incel communities, the ideology known as the black pill becomes that exact narrative.
It gives them a powerful, all-encompassing explanation for their pain. It completely reframes their experience. It shifts the cause from that personal helplessness, I am a failure, to universal helplessness. The system is rigged, and no one like me can ever succeed. The blame gets moved outward, onto society, onto feminism, onto genetics.
But this is where we have to get really nuanced, because it's not like everyone who adopts this narrative ends up in the same place. It's not that simple. Even within this community, people can take very, very different psychological paths. So, how do we know this? Well, a major worldwide study surveyed 288 self-identified incels and ran a cluster analysis to see if different psychological profiles would emerge. And what they found was fascinating. It shows that this community is absolutely not a monolith. The study basically identified three distinct profiles. First, you've got the hopers. These are guys who believe their situation is temporary, and they show low risk for both suicide and violence. Then you have the internalizers. They believe their situation is permanent, and they turn all that anger and despair inward. This leads to high suicidal thoughts, but low violent thoughts toward others. And finally, you have the externalizers. They also think their situation is permanent, but they direct their anger outward. They show low risk for suicide, but a high risk for violence. And if we zoom in on that externalizers group, a really concerning pattern emerges. This is the cluster that is most likely to blame outside forces, like feminism or society as a whole, for their problems. And here's the critical part. They also report feeling more violent after spending time on their online forums. This is the group that expresses more admiration for incels who have committed acts of mass violence. So after breaking all of this down, let's pull back out again. Why is it so important to understand all these different psychological pathways? I mean, why does this nuance actually matter in the real world?
Well, it's crucial because if we just treat everyone who feels this way as one big uniform group, then any attempt to help or intervene is probably going to fail. A hoper who thinks things can get better needs totally different support than an internalizer who is at high risk of self-harm, or an externalizer who is being radicalized towards violence. Understanding these differences is the absolute first step toward any kind of effective, targeted prevention.
And that really leaves us with this final big question. We've seen how an individual's psychology can collide with these huge social trends and powerful online ideologies. So, when a person feels completely and utterly trapped by their circumstances, where does their personal story end? And where does the story of the society that helped shape them truly begin? It's a complicated thought for sure, but definitely one worth thinking about.